introduce sort of the background. It's a paper that I recently written and submitted to a journal, but it's based on some of my PhD work, which basically examines the role of Israeli security contractors working in India and specifically in Mumbai after the 2008 attacks. So it kind of examines how local politics sort of interacts with security technology and focuses on sort of urban security and issues of cities and security. This talk doesn't really necessarily have to do with that exactly, but it sort of bites one chunk of that off, which is sort of how Israel's managed to sort of construct itself as a homeland security leader. So without further ado, I will get into that. So first thing I want to talk about a little bit is sort of Israel's sort of established itself sort of within the global security market as a kind of homeland security leader. And awareness of the status is quite broadly established, both within academia, but also beyond academic circles. So you can see in this slide, you have on one hand sort of some academic books that have tried to sort of explain the rise of Israel as a kind of homeland security capital, but then you also have these kind of business magazine features and other things on the right. This was a bestseller called Startup Nation, which has sort of tried to argue that Israel's rise as a high-tech industry is also related to its sort of prowess in the security field. So the point is that sort of its status is sort of very widespread. Even doing my research, a lot more people than you would sort of imagine sort of are aware somehow that Israel has this sort of status as a kind of leader in the counterterrorism and security field. But trying to understand sort of why this might be the case is much less clear. There's been the number of critical scholars have begun to sort of try to look at this issue, and they mostly sort of tried to argue that the status is sort of born out of a number of internal historical processes associated with the Israeli state, which are then sort of projected outward. These kinds of analysis have focused a lot of their work on the so-called Israeli Security Network, which basically focuses on the relationship between retired Israeli army officers and the private sector in Israel, and sort of looks at the ways in which these ties have sort of fostered various kinds of networks that are sort of able to extend their reach globally, which helps them to sort of market their services and project themselves abroad. In addition to sort of understanding the sort of networking aspect, these existing critical accounts have also shown how Israeli actors are sort of able to leverage so-called battle-proven expertise as a way to sort of gain a competitive edge in the global marketplace. But while these approaches have made a very important sort of contribution to our understanding of how we might understand Israel's rise as a homeland security capital, they don't really sort of deal with the ways in which Israel sort of managed to construct itself as sort of a universal or mobile kind of policy exemplar to be sort of emulated by others. It doesn't sort of pay much attention also to how these practices or strategies actually sort of transform as they might move geographically. So in this talk, I'm going to sort of present a slightly different theoretical approach for how we might sort of approach the understanding of Israel's status as a homeland security capital. I'm going to suggest that we can't really sort of limit ourselves to questions of sort of marketing that transfer sort of existing practices or coherent technologies or sort of strategies from one place to another. And I'm going to sort of say that it's not just a question of sort of understanding it as a discursive process that tries to sort of legitimate certain practices and project them abroad. I'm going to sort of suggest that we can understand Israel's dominance as a homeland security leader in terms of its realization of this status through encounters beyond Israel and Palestine in ways that sort of stabilize their practices as global models. So rather than sort of taking a pre-existing audience as sort of a given that receives these messages, I'm going to sort of suggest that we can understand this market or audience sort of being performed into being by the activities of these actors themselves. I'm also going to suggest that we can understand the sort of the process of this in terms of sort of a question of becoming. That's sort of a dynamic and emergent process that is not entirely solidified as of yet. This point is critical as it allows us to understand the sort of flexibility of Israeli security products on the move, whilst helping to constitute the misleading singularity of a kind of singular Israeli approach to security. So now I'm just going to sort of talk a little bit about sort of this idea of Israel as a homeland security laboratory. So this can be seen in the number of sort of marketing of Israeli security products and the industry more broadly. Basically, it sort of suggests that people like scholars like Neve Gordon have argued that sort of we can understand Israel's rise as a homeland security capital through a range of sort of symbolic and technological factors associated with the Israeli state. But then he also suggests that sort of these processes are sort of later projected outward. As I said, this claim to battle-tested experience can be commonly observed in various marketing materials of the industry, but it's also something that's broadly shared among critics as well. So, for example, on the right, you see this recent film. It's an Israeli film called The Lab, which has essentially argued that Israel's success in the weapons industry and the security industry is sort of born out of this largely evolutionary process whereby the IDF essentially tests their products and services on live Palestinian bodies, and that they're able to sort of establish a kind of claim to battle-proven expertise. And a number of Israeli politicians often make similar sort of evolutionary claims. The Shimon Peres quote sort of illustrates there's a kind of technological determinism or sort of evolutionism or social Darwinism that suggests that sort of the reason that they've managed to establish this status has to do with the fact that they've sort of been able to experiment. So anyway, this idea of this sort of Homeland Security laboratory, on one hand, has been sort of brought up by critical scholars, but on the other hand, has also been sort of a key marketing trope of the industry itself. So this is just a quote from the gentleman who invented that particular weapon. It's called the corner shot. So you can kind of see how this idea is sort of used. He's sort of suggesting that the ability to sort of test on real live bodies allows Israeli inventors to sort of perfect their technologies. He talked to me about how they're able to sort of, if they have a bullet that they think is particularly amazing, they can sort of give it to the army, and the army can find out in real life whether or not those claims are true. And again, so this is very common both in marketing, but when you speak to these contractors that I spoke to, it's something that comes up quite a lot. So in terms of how this works analytically, sort of from a sort of critical perspective, the sort of critical scholars have sort of used this idea in sort of two distinct ways. They've firstly been able to sort of suggest that the laboratory metaphor is used as a way to sort of understand the technological development of technologies themselves, sort of through experimental testing over time. And the other way is sort of to, like I said, as a marketing ploy, to sort of make claims to this battle-proven expertise. So you can kind of see this on the right here. You have this product and this stamp of approval that's literally a stamp of approval on certain things. It's sort of something commonly seen in brochures and various marketing materials. The step into the known is from this company that makes a radar that can see through the walls. So anyway, you can kind of see this being used that way. So as Neve Gordon argues, quote, the ability to test products serves two important goals. First, it allows companies to improve their goods through trial and error. And second, it enables companies to establish or demonstrate some truth about their products and services, which both certifies them and provides them with credit. He further argues that, quote, this experience also engenders a regime of truth involving the management and control of populations that resonates among certain politicians and institutions, particularly after 9/11. So according to him and others, these factors have sort of helped position the Israelis as global leaders, as well as to sort of perpetuate the kinds of dangers that they also in turn intervene in and try to sort of quote-unquote solve. So from my fieldwork in Israel, as I said, it soon became clear that this reputation based on sort of real-world experimentation clearly does play a role in the marketing of these firms, and it sort of has an undeniable role in the success of the sort of Israeli Homeland Security industry as a whole. Most contractors I talked about the importance of the so-called Israeli brand in promoting their products and services abroad. But it also had certain limitations that I found. Many contractors I spoke with, for example, talked about the importance of the brand on one hand, but then they also talked about sort of the need to sort of the persistence in terms of actually selling, that they have to sort of project themselves outward all the time and then sort of engage in various forms of work to sort of get themselves out there. But even more strikingly, certain representatives also pointed out that there were sort of actually problems and limitations associated with the Israeli brand that they have to sort of negotiate in the work that they do. As one marketing director explained to me, although being an Israeli company can be useful to attracting new customers, quote, I don't push it because some people don't like it. Even though they respect Israeli technology, there's unfortunately a lot of bad press about Israel. So this is kind of the sort of negative reputation of the Israeli state, according to him and others, sort of on one, to some extent, sort of interfered with their ability to actually sell to certain countries and was sort of a bit more touchy than you might imagine. Others further told me that the value of the Israeli brand was a variable rather than a constant, depending on the target market at hand. For example, one representative, in summarizing about the Israeli brand, said, quote, in Africa it doesn't matter, in Israel it helps a lot because Israeli companies are appreciated there, but in Europe you have to camouflage it. So on one hand, while the Israeli brand was presented as something that was sort of generally useful for these contractors, they also suggested that its importance was sort of more flexible rather than completely definitive, and that it was something that they had to sort of use in different ways depending on the target market at hand. So far, I've basically been starting to talk about sort of the ways in which existing critical scholarship has sort of understood the rise of Israel's Homeland Security capital or laboratory, and sort of suggested that they largely understand it as an internal process that sort of takes existing objects or practices or strategies and then finds ways to sort of market or move them outside. And a number of companies I spoke with did sort of explain their development in these sort of fairly simple terms. This was definitely the case for sort of smaller niche companies that focused on really one very specific technology or another, who essentially said that they developed their products in Israel and or Palestine, and sort of once it was perfected to a sort of certain degree, then they would try to market them elsewhere. But this was definitely not always the case. Some companies that I spoke with didn't do any actual work in Israel at all as a matter of corporate policy. And sort of others, many spoke of sort of products and services that they've perfected in Israel that don't actually become marketable commodities elsewhere. So sort of the idea here is basically that not all Israeli security products necessarily become mobile export commodities. Perhaps even more importantly, though, all of the companies that I spoke with, sort of regardless of the specific origins of their products, spoke about how sort of working internationally ultimately reshaped their companies and the nature of the work they do, as well as their future product development. So here you can kind of see that this is one company, Magal, that has did a lot of work on the fence around Israel and parts of Gaza. And on the left, it's just their sort of Israeli headquarters that I visited when I interviewed one of their representatives. And on the right, you see this as kind of a mobile object to some extent. This is from a trade show in India, where you can sort of see their stand set up as something that can sort of be taken anywhere. So on one end, the left is sort of a very domestic, a very sort of banal looking building that is very, very Israeli. And on the other sort of hand, you have this idea of this company being something that you can sort of take up anywhere around the world. So that's what I want to sort of get into understanding how that might actually happen. In addition to some of the sort of problems with the Israeli brand, though, another important thing was sort of that a number of contractors that I spoke with actually sort of questioned the extent to which Israeli security, quote-unquote, solutions or products sort of actually have an inherent universal appeal. As one CEO put it, quote, no security professional, Israeli professional, really believes that what we use here for a certain problem will be valid for another place. We are aware that we have unique circumstances. So based on this, I want to kind of suggest that we can't really take as a basic starting point the idea that sort of Israeli security products or services or strategies, whatever they might be, have a kind of inherently universal or mobile quality, and that we need to sort of understand this as a sort of contingent feature that's actually born out of various forms of work. As Eugene McCann has pointed out, for example, it's important to, quote, avoid fetishizing policies as naturally mobile objects. As he and other scholars of policy mobility have pointed out, sort of bound up with the development of a policy model is also the constitution of an audience, which is essential to sort of giving policy exemplars their global appeal. As Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore argue, for instance, quote, a policy model can only exist as a model once it's enrolled an audience of interlocutors and would-be emulators. So based on this, I want to sort of suggest ways that we might think about this mobile quality sort of becoming realized. And there's sort of two main strategies that I want to look at. So the first one is just sort of that I sort of encountered with speaking to a number of Israeli security contractors, is to sort of present themselves as ahead of their time. So they basically sort of tried to sort of occurred in two main ways. Rather than sort of staking claims to being superior within a broader field of security experts, they sort of suggested that they invented the whole notion of security itself. For example, a little bit audacious perhaps, when I asked one representative what gave Israel their advantage over non-Israeli competitors, he responded that in general, security should be thought of as an Israeli notion because, quote, Israel is surrounded by enemies, our way of life is security. A number of other representatives I spoke with also frequently made comparisons with the experiences of Israel and other countries, suggesting that Israel was a kind of innovator that was ahead of its time. For example, referring to the challenges faced by the U.S. Army in the war on terror, one representative told me that, quote, these things are now people understand what happened to us 30 years ago. Others are just facing this now. So basically the implication of this is that sort of Israel is presented as this kind of security, what I call sort of security clairvoyant, something sort of like ahead of their time that can sort of anticipate future developments and thereby help others sort of plan for their current security needs. This sort of situates Israel on one hand as sort of an incomparable experience, what they call the Israeli experience in one hand, but in another way it sort of makes it a kind of general practical knowledge that others can benefit from and according to the Israelis should benefit from. So attentions to these kind of narratives, I want to suggest, show sort of how mobile policies are actually sort of shaped and given momentum by the telling of stories about them in ways that define themselves as models to be emulated, while also managing to uphold and sort of preserve the specificity of the Israeli experience. By presenting Israel's violent history of Homeland Security sort of as Homeland Security, they sort of use it as a platform to define security in general, whilst additionally asserting Israel's leadership in relation to the rest of the world, which is sort of, they suggest, is always and sort of necessarily ahead of what will come next for the rest of the world. The second main strategy, though, is a little bit different. So this deals with the kind of materiality of certain objects. We have some rather strange objects here. On the left, you have this, what's called kind of a mobile guard tower, which can sort of be taken up anywhere in the world. You can put on a flatbed truck and sort of be assembled in less than half an hour. In the middle here, you have these, quote, unquote, backpackable UAVs that are sort of a class of UAVs or drones called micro or mini UAVs, which are incredibly tiny and can sort of be packed up in a backpack or other small device. And on the right here, you have another kind of bizarre device, which is called the shield case, which you can kind of assemble a bulletproof shield whenever you might happen to need it on an airplane or elsewhere in case you might get into a sort of tough situation. So far I've sort of talked about the sort of discursive ways in which Israel's status is sort of constructed as a leader, but in this section I want to sort of talk a little bit about how this is constituted in a more sort of materialist sense. In particular, the issue of portability, which you can kind of see in all of these products, is something that sort of came up a lot in the conversations. As one representative told me, Israel's typically been known for, quote, smaller technologies, more portable technologies, more immediate technologies, things that can be brought in the field right away. This was often sort of talked about as in terms of a tactical issue, in terms of trying to actually be able to sort of move things around easily in terms of sort of fighting against terrorists or catching migrants or various other things. But they also sort of suggested that it had something to do with the ability of these things to be taken up in a range of diverse contexts. As one CEO from these backpackable UAVs told me, quote, portability is very important as it will increase or let's say decrease the limitation and will increase the usage of the system. So it's a major factor in design. So closely related to how sort of portability is materially inscribed into these products as a means of improving their tactical capabilities, these traits I want to suggest also sort of allow them to be taken up as sort of mobile objects to be used elsewhere. This fetishization of portability concerns, however, can also lead to some rather bizarre innovations. For example, the shield cases I mentioned, and many others, it was not always sort of clear what exactly their purpose was, and it seemed in some sense that sort of the drive to make things even sort of endlessly mobile sometimes generated products that might not sort of always meet their own targets. But whether or not these sort of mobilizing efforts are necessarily successful, I think the crucial point is that they're mobile qualities, whether or not they're successful products, are sort of reached through various forms of work rather than sort of being inherent features. So now I just want to talk a little bit about another issue. So far I've kind of talked about the ways in which Israeli Homeland Security actors are able to sort of cultivate their status as leaders, and as well as sort of developing mobile or universally qualities to their products and services. And I've suggested this is sort of through staging the Israeli experience in a particular way, as well as sort of in a material sense with these specific products. But in this section, I want to talk a little bit about how the actual work of Israeli firms abroad has actually played a role in sort of constituting their status as leaders. I want to sort of suggest that the transnational movement of Israeli security professionals in a way sort of bestows greater credibility on these same actors by sort of allowing them to claim a quote-unquote international status. So interestingly, you can see here in the marketing materials that I looked at from a number of Israeli companies, they often reference their Israeli work sort of domestically within Israel itself, for example, at Ben Gurion Airport or on the security fence or whatever. But they also frequently sort of reference their projects overseas. So on the left here, this is a company that makes security crash bollards, and this is from their website. It sort of suggests that they're already installed sort of in prominent places around the world. And the right one here is from a company called Mifrem, which makes these various kinds of guard towers, and on their website, again, they're sort of trying to suggest that their product has already been taken up along the US border fence. It's sort of not necessarily the most convincing image, I would say, but the point is that they're sort of trying to suggest that they're sort of already dominant. So, for example, one industry brochure proclaims that, quote, the prominent position gained by Israel's security industries is reflected in a growing number of security projects that have been won by Israeli contractors in recent years. Israeli security systems protect some of the major symbols of Western civilization, including Buckingham Palace, the Vatican, and the Eiffel Tower. So I want to sort of suggest that sort of rather than sort of speaking to the sort of weight of symbolic signifiers that sort of exist prior to the encounter with foreign audiences, that these sort of claims are actually realized as they sort of get taken up elsewhere. This, I think, suggests sort of a reevaluation about the way in which we look at the relationship between sort of the ideas of preeminence and superiority. As Donald Mackenzie has argued, for example, quote, technologies may be best because they have triumphed rather than triumphing because they are best. In addition, you can see sort of through their applications abroad how these technologies and practices in some ways actually sort of become more universal. A number of contractors told me sort of that their work beyond the Middle East and beyond Israel has sort of helped them to calibrate their systems to sort of conditions that are not necessarily those that you would find within Israel, which in turn allows them to develop new products which can be sort of marketed and sold around the world. So these kind of encounters and these sort of experiences with foreign customers, I want to suggest, sort of actually, in a very real sense, help them to actually make their products increasingly more universal and potentially more mobile. But these kinds of considerations also sort of raise some questions about sort of how we might think about Israel ever having been purely domestic in the first place. As I've sort of begun to talk about, one of the striking features of the Israeli Homeland Security industry is its ability to speak in a common language about a shared experience, thereby giving the sector a sort of strong sense of coherence and singularity. But there's sort of another sort of key reason why people sort of think about Israel as a singular sort of experience or model is this notion of the Homeland Security Laboratory. As I began to talk about, sort of this is a position that's shared largely by critics and industry proponents alike. As one industry brochure puts it, quote, Israel's domestic security is largely self-reliant, depending mainly on homegrown defense and information technologies. So this idea of Israel as this kind of closed domestic space through this laboratory metaphor where sort of technologies are developed and perfected, and sort of suggesting that it has nothing to do with the outside world until they're sort of reached a certain level of perfection. They also suggest that their products are sort of developed to serve the imminent needs of the Israeli security forces, and that they sort of just respond to imminent needs. So these kind of narratives suggest that to present Israeli security firms as pragmatic problem solvers that simply sort of respond to the needs of the IDF. They also importantly allow such firms to effectively shirk any responsibility for the conflicts that they so clearly benefit from and reproduce. So there's clearly a kind of ideological stake in these claims about Israel, about the industry as a kind of reflecting this sense of domesticity. But despite the prevalence and power of these kind of homegrown narratives, which suggest that Israel's security capabilities exist prior and independently to the requirements of foreign clients, there's a number of further reasons to question this logic. Firstly, from a theoretical standpoint, it's important to recall that binary spatial and scalar descriptors, such as global and local, and international and domestic, are much less tenable than might be typically imagined. As scholars like Wendy Larner and William Walters have argued, the very act of naming sites as global or local should be understood as a kind of a form of power in its own right. Secondly, however, these sort of domestic origin narratives often sort of fail to stand up empirically. As I talked to the various representatives about their genesis of their products, they sort of were revealed to be particularly hollow often, where their sort of claims to having simply responded to a particular need of the IEF to some extent fell apart. So I have these two images. On the left side, we have this kind of system that looks sort of very, very domestic. This is from one company that sort of shared some of their images with me. This is an electric fence system. And this is kind of one of the companies that did sort of in many ways develop their systems for a direct imminent need. They sort of marketed themselves to settlers in Gaza, and once they sort of got them up to a certain level of technological sophistication, then they went to the export market. But on the other hand, another thing that Israel sort of positioned itself as a leader in is these kind of safe city or smart city initiatives. These sort of combine sophisticated video analytic software with surveillance devices in order to monitor major urban centers. But while Israel sort of tried to position itself as a leader in safe city and smart city initiatives, one of the sort of companies that's one of the leaders in this field from Israel told me that none of these systems have ever actually been developed as, or sort of undertaken as such within Israel. So typically safe city and smart city projects are sort of for massive megacities, and there's simply no city even on close to that scale within Israel. But despite the fact that sort of no safe city or smart city system has ever actually been developed in Israel, they have worked on a number of these projects overseas. And this is a kind of fact that they often emphasize in their marketing as well, like I've talked about. So rather than sort of suggesting that they've worked on a safe city project in Israel, which they clearly haven't, they sort of suggest that they've worked in Rio or in China or various other places as a way to sort of project themselves as leaders. Sort of my point here is not to sort of decide whether or not Israeli technologies should be understood as purely sort of domestic or international or global factors. I think this idea that they're one or the other is sort of problematic in certain ways. The point is that sort of the idea of Israel and the sort of the Israeli experience is a kind of closed domestic space, and the way that the idea of the Homeland Security Laboratory works is a kind of somewhat of a misleading ideological construct that we shouldn't necessarily sort of take for granted. Well, a number of representatives I spoke with sort of talked about various Israeli principles that inform the nature of their work. It seemed that their sort of Israeliness was materialized through various encounters with specific clients based on the unique circumstances governing these particular imperatives. As one CEO who's in this picture explained, quote, "This is our strength, being Israeli, but we're also a foreign company." So you can see him here. He's also Brazilian, and you can see him there with former President Lula da Silva and also with Rudy Giuliani. But he and others sort of told me that the roles they play and the extent to which they are Israeli or not Israeli really depends on the situation at hand. And the Brazil example is quite interesting because even though Brazil doesn't have strong relations with Israel, Israeli companies have worked on a number of projects, especially in relation to the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics that are coming up. So I'm trying to sort of suggest that these difficulties with the Israeli state are sort of negotiated through these encounters with these contractors. A number of representatives sort of told me that sort of being Israeli was something that was sort of like a flexible variable that could be leveraged depending on the situation, or potentially also withheld depending on which target market they're approaching. They also told me that various countries, particularly in the Middle East, that are deemed to be hostile to Israel, the Israeli state, they sort of use front companies or different subsidiaries in order to sell to these countries that might not otherwise want to buy their products. One company even told me that they had the capacity to sort of manufacture their products in third countries so that the sort of materials couldn't be traced back to Israel in terms of the wiring and various other things. So in light of the sort of persistent claims that the Israeli brand is a key selling point of Israeli firms, this underlying flexibility seems kind of striking and unexpected. But I think of even greater theoretical concern is to understand how these encounters of Israeli companies with foreign clients sort of has functioned to bolster the idea of a singular Israeli approach to security. While clearly drawing on the symbolic power of the Israeli experience, we can say that these sort of encounters help to make them into successes through their introduction into real-world settings beyond Israel and Palestine. Indeed, it is through these interactions and work for international clients that the very idea of an Israeli security model is invented and stabilized as such. In addition to legitimating and transforming practices and technologies as they move geographically, however, these applications also sort of help to constitute the false sense of the original, in the sense that there was ever sort of a pre-existing strategy or product that was simply marketed abroad. In a way, I think they can be there because their Israeliness can be leveraged or withheld depending on the situation. They can sort of be anything that their target market requires them to be based on the particular imperatives that govern them. So, despite advocating for standardization around a supposed Israeli model, I want to suggest these dynamics operate quite unlike what Latour has called the immutable mobiles. They seem to sort of undergo a number of important symbolic and material shifts as they move geographically. And I think it is this sort of underlying adaptiveness and flexibility that actually allows them to be taken up in a range of different diverse contexts. But the apparent sort of tentativeness within these dynamics, I think, is also crucial. In contrast to industry claims, which suggest that the Israeli brand is reflective of a singular essence derived from battle-proven expertise, the narratives presented here suggest otherwise. As I've so far suggested, efforts to export Israeli security solutions face a range of practical and political challenges in extending their global reach. Despite the apparent tentativeness of the actual processes themselves, however, the sort of evolutionary narratives that surround their journey and the sort of idea of the laboratory metaphor sort of work to obscure such issues from view. Even though there's all kinds of contingencies that underpin the genesis and propagation of Israeli security products and services, the stories that surround their journey seem to sort of foreclose these dynamics in important ways, particularly in ways that sort of might question their universal utility or actual dominance. In this way, this kind of self-affirming mobility of Israeli security strategies sort of effectively validates the Israeli approach through their propagation in ways that render these various kinds of fissures and incoherences less visible. This dynamic seems to serve to insulate the tactics from possible political intervention by effectively presenting their efficacy as sort of self-evident and therefore immune from analysis, drawing again on this sort of technological logic of technological determinism that's so much a part of the security laboratory. These accounts sort of present Israeli Homeland Security preeminence as a fait accompli and already reached post-political consensus based on sort of allegedly unchallengeable facts, which draw, again, on the kind of Darwinian logic that is so essential to the Israeli experience. I want to suggest that this represents a form of depoliticization through the foreclosure of politics itself, a process that's closely bound up with the global mobility of Israeli Homeland Security solutions. I want to suggest that this false sense of post-political consensus may ultimately be one of Israel, the industry's sort of most consequential products. So based on this, I want to suggest that we sort of, to some extent, reapproach the way in which we look at the sort of politics of occupation and the role of the Israeli security industry within it. So I took these two images. The left one is from my travels there, which is the wall around Gaza, which are look very imperfect in a lot of ways. I mean, the guard tower is literally kind of falling down, and it's far from smooth. But on the right, you have kind of a picture from Orad, which is one of these companies that makes various fencing systems, and it's sort of presented as this very smooth, highly technological instrument that sort of can be taken anywhere. And I kind of want to pull this a little bit apart in terms of concluding. So there's been sort of no shortage of criticism, as you know, about the Israeli occupation, and there's been also considerable attention to the role of the Homeland Security industry within that. But I want to suggest that many of these accounts, particularly the critical ones, sort of uphold the industry's sort of key evolutionary claims, that its sort of success is born out of this kind of Darwinian process. As I've begun to talk about with the sort of selective accentuation or sort of concealing of the Israeli brand, I want to suggest that there's a need to sort of re-examine the way in which we approach the politics of occupation and the role of the industry within that broader discussion. Despite the persistence of industry claims to real-life testing, it is certainly a troubling trend that does reflect empirical processes on the ground in Palestine. But these claims also clearly sort of perpetuate the occupation and legitimate it by sort of selling its products elsewhere. But I think as critical scholars, we must be cautious in adopting this metaphor too readily in understanding the rise of Israel as a homeland security capital. To be sure, Israel's status as a homeland security capital is an important achievement in its own right, both in terms of legitimating Israel's practices of occupation, as well as promoting its company's activities abroad. Yet the way in which this status has been built cannot be limited to issues of legitimation and validation that work to transfer coherent objects or doctrines from one locale to another. I instead want to argue that it's also crucially bound up with their development or even invention. It's as much through the industry's assertion of dominance beyond Israel that their claims to superiority gain their force by staking a claim to already existing global superiority. Indeed, this strategy works quite ingeniously to blend claims of superiority with claims to preeminence in ways that make the two largely indistinguishable from another. I want to suggest that these are most successful through their ability to become one and the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent.